Wait, pause your Hearts of Iron 4 game and watch this video regarding the Second Italo-Abyssinian War in 1935, where Italy struggled to conquer Ethiopia. While you may shrug it off as Italy losing wouldn't change much, I would argue against that, as the government of a certain Italian bold politician would collapse as a result of this embarrassing defeat. This may even lead to a civil war between the loyalists of the king and the ultranationalists. The communists in Italy can also rebel, so it can become a three-way civil war. Another thing that happened with the failed Italian invasion is that Italy was kicked out of the League of Nations, so they were internationally isolated. France and Britain condemned the Italian invasion, so Italy was left with no allies, resulting in them to ally with Germany. Initially, Italy was supposed to protect Austria, but they gave up on the country in exchange for an alliance with Germany and future gains in the Balkans. You may be surprised that in the beginning of the Second Italo-Abyssinian War, Germany actually sent 16,000 rifles and 600 machine guns to Ethiopia, as in 1935 Italy was still an enemy of Germany, because they were allied with France and Britain and guaranteeing the independence of Austria. If my prediction for an Italian civil war is correct, then it's very possible for Italy and Germany to never ally in the Second World War, which would change drastically how and where the war is fought. Italy has also historically failed in their first invasion of Ethiopia, which was back in 1895. The Italians failed this invasion because they underestimated Ethiopia, but also because Russia supported the Ethiopian cause, which was a fellow Orthodox Christian country. I want to discuss the first war, so we can see how Ethiopia won the first time, and apply it to their war with Italy 40 years later, which already has a proven method of how Ethiopia could win. Regarding the last point of Russia helping Ethiopia the first time, this was true, but the Russians were too late. The decisive battle was the Battle of Adwa, and the Russian Red Cross arrived 3 months after this decisive battle. The main reason why Italy lost the war is because they were looking for a decisive victory, rather than going for a war of attrition. Initially, Italy had occupied most of the Tigray province, but slightly retreated back due to supply issues. The Ethiopian army was suffering from the same problem, where they were living off the lands and trading their own villages for supplies. The Italian general and governor Urieste Bariatelli knew that, but the Italian government back home demanded a quick victory. So instead of waiting for the Ethiopian army to collapse and suffer a famine, he was forced to attack. It was argued that a retreat of the Italian army or any further delay of an offensive would just worsen the already low morale on the Italian army. General Vittorio de Burmida, who was later killed in combat, said Italy would prefer the loss of 2,000 or 3,000 men, rather to a dishonorable retreat. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian army, led by Menelik II, had around 100,000 recruited soldiers, so they outnumbered the Italians 5 to 1. You may think that the Ethiopian army was poorly armed, as a lot of the soldiers and cavalry were armed with lances and spears, but a substantial part of the army had rifles and knew how to use them. The historian Chris Prutti has said that Italy lost because they had inadequate maps, old model guns, poor communication equipment and inferior foot gear for the rocky ground. Morale on the Italian side was very low, as the veterans wanted to go home and the newly recruited soldiers didn't have any combat experience. The Italian army also consisted of Eritrean askaris, who were native to Eritrea and didn't have any combat experience. The Italians marched to the Ethiopian army through narrow mountain passes. There were 4 main army groups, where 1 stayed back and 3 split up and went through separate mountain passes. The Ethiopian side was also planning an attack, and this proved to be as a nice opportunity, so the Ethiopian army found it easy to destroy the Italians, who had no intelligence of the upcoming attack. The Italian army was overrun and a retreat was ordered, but they couldn't organize in time, so Ethiopia captured a lot of prisoners. When news of the defeat reached Italy, there were street demonstrations in most major cities, with the return of the soldiers being called. Ethiopia won the battle, but they decided not to chase Italy out of Ethiopia, as they thought it would just enrage the Italians and make sure that they returned better prepared in a few years. Right now, we have enough information on how when Italy returns 40 years later, in 1935, the Ethiopians can win a second time. The main problem of Ethiopia in the Second Italo-Abyssinian War is that the Ethiopians refused to modernize. The victory in the war against Italy in 1895 encouraged the isolationist and the conservative branches of the government that there is no need to modernize, adopt Western tactics and weapons. This proved to be disastrous, as in the Second Italo-Abyssinian War there were instances of people with spears fighting against a tank. Both Menelik II and Haile Selassie were opposed to this, but they had to comply as Ethiopia was divided among many religions and nationalities, so going against the status quo could be a great mistake. Speaking of Haile Selassie, I want to show you these two coins I have that I think are from 1943, but it's very hard to tell. As a result, they were used after the British liberated Italian East Africa in 1941. You can just see how unique Ethiopian coins were from that time, and I bet you didn't expect me to pull out my Ethiopian coin collections from the Second World War. I also have this 1 lira coin from Italy, which was produced in 1940. But also these 5 centimes from 1941. So it's interesting to put these pairs of coins side by side, as these countries were enemies for decades. Now let me return back to the video. This means that for Ethiopia to succeed without any outside intervention, most likely they would need to modernize and centralize, which is likely to cause a civil war, as this would upset many isolationist and conservative factions. This very much goes against the Ethiopian traditional way of living, so a civil war is really possible. The government would need to secure a victory in order to remain in power and not collapse into multiple states. This can happen around the end of the First World War, as Italy would be busy dealing with far more important things in Europe than to take advantage of an Ethiopian civil war. Even if Ethiopia doesn't achieve total victory in the Second Italo-Abyssinian War, prolonging the war would also have several benefits for the future allies. This is because they can sanction Italy more effectively, which they couldn't do in our timeline. For example, oil was excluded from the sanctions, so Italian tanks and airplanes could still operate. This is one way to make Ethiopia more competent, but I want to give you another option, which is less realistic, but I think it makes for a more interesting scenario. So I'm sacrificing realism for an interesting scenario, remember that. Historically, when the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie got invaded by Italy, he left the country and went to the League of Nations, as he wanted to secure domestic support. This meant that his government would be vulnerable, so if there was a civil war prior to that, as I predicted, if the country modernizes and abolishes its traditional way of living, there could be a change of leadership. The Soviet Union may actually intervene and send weapons to Ethiopia, through French Djibouti. This is not as realistic as in the previous scenario where Ethiopia just has a civil war, but is modernized and better equipped, but having a communist Ethiopia would change quite a lot. I want to quickly go back to my coin collection and show you that I have this 5 franc coin from Djibouti, which was made in 1946, so a year after the Second World War had ended. This coin is made out of cheap aluminum, as France was struggling economically after the war. Hope that you enjoyed my Ethiopian and Djibouti coins that I have got my hands on. Continuing with the scenario, having a communist Ethiopia would create for a very entertaining video. This is because I think it would start a domino effect of countries flipping to communism. I made a prediction that if Italy were to lose, it would result in a civil war, so the communists are more likely to win as a result of that. Again, that's not realistic, but more interesting. The realistic outcome is that Ethiopia just wins, takes Eritrea and maybe Somalia, but still loses these territories in the 1990s. Just the Ogaden War is prevented, which doesn't change world history in any way. So here, this is your realistic answer. Nothing much will change in world history. Now that you got your realistic answer, let us have some fun with this scenario. The Second Italo-Abyssinian War started because of an event now known as the Wow Wow incident. This happened as Italy built fortifications inside of Ethiopia and wanted to keep it. The problem is that the border between Italy and Ethiopia was a bit of a grey area, so it wasn't well defined. Now we know that it wasn't a minor mistake, but it was built 130 kilometers or 81 miles inside of Ethiopia's territory. Italy wanted to invade Ethiopia, but the League of Nations ruled against it and wanted to put economic sanctions on Italy. This resulted in Italy to quit the League of Nations and made a special deal with France and Britain, who recognized the annexation of Ethiopia in 1938. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian army went to the fortifications at Wow Wow and asked the Italian garrisons to leave, but they refused. The following days there was a skirmish between the two sides, which resulted in the death of 107 Ethiopians and 50 Somalis and Italians. A couple of months of diplomatic protests followed on both sides, as on the 3rd of October, Italy invaded Ethiopia from Eritrea, without having a declaration of war. To give Ethiopia a better chance to secure a victory in this war, we should have Haile Selassie leave the country immediately and go to Europe, where he can protest this unjustified war. I bet that with this action, he can secure some support and most importantly, actually force some countries to embargo Italy. Romania was at the time strongly against Italy, as during the meeting of the League of Nations, the Romanian representatives sided strongly with the Ethiopians. As a result, oil from Romania will not reach Italy, which is important. The Soviet Union was the only country in Europe that could supply the Italian army with its much needed resources, but they would ask for some favors in return. Now the most important fact to consider is that France and Britain really hoped for this war to end quickly. Earlier I mentioned a secret deal between these countries, which was that Italy was about to annex Ethiopia, but they would have to stand up against Germany. As we all know, this failed miserably in 1938, but in 1934 Italy was actually the reason why Germany couldn't annex Austria. Again, for the final time, I want to remind you that this video is not realistic, and I'm not trying to be realistic. I have a cool ending cooking up, and I already gave you a realistic answer. So in this alternate history, the Soviet Union would sell oil to Italy in return for some concessions, which would matter later in the scenario. But the Soviets would also secretly send Ethiopia guns via French Djibouti. As a result, the Soviet Union is guaranteeing that at least one of these countries would turn communist and join their cause. This would soon happen in the case of Ethiopia, as Haile Selassie was not present in the country, but there would have been a civil war 20 years prior to that, which many would still remember. The communists in Ethiopia would promise to end the war without losing any territory, while also restore the traditional way of living, sort of like what Lenin promised during the October Revolution. This would be a huge selling point, and the communist faction would just go stronger and stronger by the day, and eventually would rule the country. When this happens, the Soviet Union can stop its oil to Italy, as they didn't want the Italians to annex their communist subject. Considering that the war ended in February 1937, delaying its conclusion by just 1 year would have dramatic implications in Europe. This can happen if Italy repeats the same mistake of last time, which is to order a decisive victory rather than to have a war of attrition. If the war is prolonged for 1 more year, it can result in Germany to freely annex Austria, without Italy being able to respond. Mussolini would see the writing on the wall, as the ultranationalist party in Austria was growing stronger, so it would become a matter of time for Germany to do its advance, hence why the Italians would have to finish this war quickly. The Italian generals would be ordered to capture Addis Ababa in 3 months, or face repercussions. This is because the Italian public would at this point be a year into the conflict, without any signs of this resulting in an Italian victory, hence why the public would pressure the government to end this war quickly, but also have a victory. All we need is for one catastrophic Italian defeat, which is very much possible if the Italians are in a rush to capitulate Ethiopia, and the Soviet Union is supplying Ethiopia with weapons. If Italy loses a decisive battle, which is really possible to happen in these circumstances, there is going to be a lot of pressure back home, even worse than in the First Italo-Abyssinian War. Italy would have to pull out of Ethiopia and secure peace as soon as possible, just so the government doesn't collapse. In the peace treaty, Ethiopia would annex all of Italian East Africa, which is what the Soviet Union would force the Ethiopians to do. First, so they can have a larger coastline, increasing the communist presence in the Red Sea, but also because it would further humiliate Italy. This Italian humiliation is required as it would make the situation back home even worse. This should hopefully for the Soviet Union secure a communist rebellion in Italy. No matter what, it would become the end for Benito Mussolini, as he would get replaced by somebody else. It doesn't matter who is in charge, as I think that there is soon going to be a civil war in the country. The south of Italy would want the king to assume control, while the north would see a lot of unemployment and riots, which are breeding ground for a communist revolution. Italy would see its unemployment rate increase, as the embargo would blockade key materials to be imported, and products to be exported. Italy may even suffer a partial famine as a result of that, so I think that the communists have a very good shot at forming a government. As for the Italian ultranationalists, since they lost a war against Ethiopia, they would lose practically all of the support and credibility that they had. Assuming that, the borders between the Kingdom of Italy and the communists would look like this. The North would control most of the industry and resources, while also the Soviet Union would support them. In the meantime, Yugoslavia can take the opportunity to annex Zadar and maybe Istria, but the latter is more unlikely. This alternate Italian civil war would coincide with the one in Spain, but still, nationalist Spain would come out on top, even without Italy's support. Meanwhile, Germany would annex Austria, if they hadn't already. As for the Munich conference, it may look more different, as the Italians will not be invited due to their civil war. Still, the Sudetenland would be handed over to Germany, and later the whole of Czechoslovakia would become German. The Second World War may start in exactly the same way, as the German Führer thought that the policy of appeasement would continue forever. Historically, he was even surprised that the Allies actually declared war on him after he invaded Poland, which caused a brief period of panic in the German High Command. By that time, the Italians would have finished with their civil war and consolidated power over the country, forming a stable and dictatorial communist government. Italy would stay out of the Second World War for the time being, but it wouldn't make a difference initially. This is because historically Italy joined before the fall of France, so the Germans would just replicate the success without the Italians on their side. This means that Germany would still capitulate Poland, conquer Denmark and Norway, the whole of the Benelux and France. Later, Germany would focus on the Balkans, but it would have a tougher time securing allies. This time, Italy will not invade Greece, so there is no need for Germany to invade Yugoslavia and ally with Bulgaria, which they did historically only so they can get to Greece and help Italy out. Also in this timeline, Albania exists as they were never annexed by the Italians. Still, out of ideological reasons, the Germans would invade the Soviet Union. Italy would just sit idle, but a war on them may also be declared eventually by the Germans. We all know how the Eastern Front went, but if this time Germany were to invade Italy, it can become very disastrous. This is because Italy's industry is mostly located up north, which means that the Germans can easily bomb it or invade it. On the other hand, the allies of France and Britain, and later the United States of America, would send help to the Soviet Union and Italy, via the Lend-Lease program. The allies can rush to the Italian front lines, as finally they would have a foothold in Europe, which means that there is no point for Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day, to take place. The front line in Italy would prove to be difficult to push on either side, as we saw how slow pushing was on the Apennine Peninsula historically. Still, I would assume that some French cities like Marseille would be liberated, maybe due to naval invasion as it happened historically. I want to quickly discuss the culture and the national heritage of Italy, as they are a country that has a lot of churches, but now they would be under a communist dictatorship. I assume that some buildings like Duomo di Milano would either get bombed by the Germans or get destroyed by the Italian communists. This is real footage I managed to take when I visited Duomo di Milano myself last year. Considering that all is the same, the Soviet Union would still win at Stalingrad, and soon happen to find itself on the outskirts of Berlin, liberating many countries in the process. The Allies would debate if they also should land on the north of France as to open up another front against Germany. For the sake of this video, I say that the Allies decided this is too risky and costly, so they stick to their Apennine front, which would be a great mistake for the Allies. It would allow for the Soviet Union to advance deeper into Germany and its allies, while France, Britain and the United States of America would be stuck in the Alps. In the peace treaty, I would say that the Soviet Union gets a way better deal, maybe taking all of Germany except the Saarland, which would be annexed by France. Austria would also be fully communist and may be allowed to join Germany, so in this timeline we would have a stronger communist world. Ethiopia is also significantly stronger, although at the cost of a communist dictatorship. When the Allies started to decolonize Africa, it's possible for more countries to flip to communism, as they would see what it did for Ethiopia, aka win the war against the Europeans. This may become a red world, just because Ethiopia went communist and won against Italy. This scenario is unrealistic, but still quite a fun one to explore. Another fun scenario to explore is what if Italy joined the Allies instead of the Axis in the Second World War. Check the video on the screen to see what would happen in this war, and I hope to see you there.